Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting schillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast welcomes Kenneth Timmerman, a senior fellow at America First Policy Institute, a Nobel Peace Prize nominee, a 9/11 investigator, and New York Times bestselling author. The new book is The Iran House, Tales of Revolution, Persecution, War, and Intrigue. And Ken Timmerman, thank you for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure.
We should talk a little bit about Iran in the pre-Islamic era because a lot of people don't remember that time, and it was a very different nation, wasn't it?
It was a different nation. Women were walking the streets of Tehran in miniskirts and heels. You did not have the chador omnipresent as it is today. You certainly did not have the morality police. And you had women who were in senior positions in the government. A very good friend of mine who now lives in the United States was the director of Iranian customs at that point. And it's not just the role of women. It's also the role of free enterprise. While certainly there was corruption under the Shah, today the Revolutionary Guards control about 80% of the Iranian economy. So just think of that for a second. If the Iranian army under the Shah controlled 80% of the economy, it would have been a disaster, and people would have revolted against that.
So when we think about the Shah of Iran, what was the relationship like between the United States of America and Iran vis-a-vis the Shah?
Well, it was up and down. There was a good relationship when Nixon was president, and Nixon sold enormous quantities of weapons to the Shah, the F-14s in particular, and all the Harpoon missiles and other equipment needed for them. And Jimmy Carter came in, and he initially called the Shah an island of stability in 1976, and very quickly totally lost touch. The CIA station in Tehran had no idea what was going on with the revolutionary movement, and the only person who did became a very good friend of mine many years later. I write about him in my new book, The Iran House, is Uri Lubrani. He was, at that point, Israel's de facto ambassador to Tehran, and he wrote back to Tel Aviv at the time a prophetic memo where he said, and this was in late 1978, so 3 months before the Shah left, when the U.S. thought he was going to be there forever. And Lubrani said, the Shah is on his way out because I saw him go down for the weekend to Kish Island, and none of his government ministers went along with him. Normally, the Shah summons you, you come, no questions asked. He said the insubordination within the government itself was palpable. He was the only one to predict the fall of the Shah. And Uri and I went on later on to work a bit the Iran file. Again, I talk about that in the book. I talk about the work we did with the opposition in Iran, and also earlier on work to get an Israeli hostage out of Lebanon.
What actually led to this revolution, and who was behind it? I mean, today, Ken, if we have revolutions in the Islamic world, it's usually Iran who's behind it. But who was behind this?
Many Iranians still believe the United States was complicit with the revolution. They believe that the French and the Brits had a role in it. There was a famous summit meeting in Guadeloupe several months earlier where there was talk of getting rid of the Shah. But frankly, I don't think you have to look into those theories when the hard evidence is that Khomeini was given refuge in France. He was allowed to broadcast into Iran through cassette tapes at the time. That was their equivalent of the internet. And smuggle those tapes into Iran. Every single mosque in the country became a war headquarters for the revolution. And it was an amazing network. Everybody underestimated it. Khomeini was in everyone's home. The Shah was only outside, if you wish. So there were tremendous social forces at work inside. And the Iranians believed, most Iranians believed at the time, that Khomeini would be a force of liberation for them. And women supported the Islamic Revolution. They clearly did not understand what they were getting into, because he had no intention of being a liberator. He wanted to impose a very stark and harsh version of Islamic law, Sharia, on the country.
Was that the first example of harsh and stark Sharia that the Western world had witnessed?
It goes back hundreds of years. I mean, we saw the U.S. Marine Corps, remember, from the shores of Tripoli, yes, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Well, the shores of Tripoli were run by the Barbary pirates, who were, in fact, commanded by the Muslim Caliph, who had Sharia law imposed then. So there has always been Sharia law throughout the Muslim world. The West has encountered it from time to time. Churchill was one of the more modern generation politicians, if you wish, who understood that Islam was incompatible with the freedoms that we enjoy in the West, and he wrote about that in many of his books.
So how did we get lost and disconnected from that wisdom that Churchill had, and certainly others, to George W. Bush calling Islam a religion of peace when it clearly isn't?
In the case of George W. Bush, I know a little bit about that story. He was subverted by a political operative in the Republican Party who convinced him that it was only because of the Muslim vote in Florida that he won the election. This person insisted that Bush make that statement. It was one of the most foolish and irresponsible things to say, especially after 9/11. 9/11 was, in fact, the jihadi attack on America. It was a work of Islamic fighters who believed that they could overthrow America and ultimately lead to an Islamic revival in the United States. And by the way, and this I talk about in the book as well, they were helped by the Iranian regime, by the Islamic Republic of Iran. There's a little glimpse of that if you read in the 9/11 Commission report on page 241, 242. You'll see that they talk about how the Iranians they brought in 8 to 10 of the muscle hijackers without stamping their passports, so they could go to and from Afghanistan without attracting attention of the West and of the United States, because they had fresh Saudi passports thanks to the Visa Express system set up by Bill Clinton. If they had Afghan stamps on them or even Pakistani stamps in their passports, probably U.S. Customs would never have allowed them to come into the country.
You worked, Ken, as a 9/11 investigator, and I'm very curious, looking at all that you've seen in your investigation, was this a preventable situation? And if so, where were the major failures?
I think it was a preventable attack. I think we had many warning signs. When I say we, I mean the U.S. government, especially the CIA. They had many warning signs ahead of time. The FBI refused to communicate with the CIA. Those stories are well known, where the CIA had been tracking a known al-Qaeda operative, and he had left the Far East and was going to the United States, and they forgot to inform the FBI that he was coming in, so the FBI never tracked him. The story I tell in the book is about an Iranian defector who ultimately became one of our witnesses in the 9/11 case against the Iranian regime, which we won, by the way, in District Court of New York, initially a $6 billion judgment. This defector came out of Iran, went to Baku, Azerbaijan, 8 weeks before the 9/11 attacks, and told the CIA there was going to be a massive attack on America using civilian airliners as weapons. The hijackers would all be Arabs. They were going to attack the World Trade Center, the CIA headquarters, the Pentagon, and the White House. Oh, by the way, the attack was going to take place on the Persian calendar date of the 20th of Shahrivar. So the CIA officer that was talking to this guy looked it up in his conversion calendar, and he said, "Oh, you mean the 10th of September? Why don't you come back then when you have a better idea what's going to happen?" And he blew it off. And that, I think, was one of many tragic errors due to arrogance made by the Central Intelligence Agency. You know, they knew something was going to happen, as George Tenet has said repeatedly in his book and elsewhere. All the alarms were going off, the lights were on, flashing red. So they knew something was going to happen, and then they blew off information like this. It's really just unconscionable to me.
Ken, was anyone ever held accountable in an official way for that blowing off?
No, they weren't. There was obviously a post 9/11 investigation, and there was some finger pointing, but to my knowledge, nobody was ultimately demoted. It gets worse than that, and that's one of the stories I tell in the Iran House. The agency people who were involved were still there. They were so desperate to get these witnesses. We had tracked down 4 witnesses for our court case against Iran. They were so desperate to track down these witnesses and get them to walk back their testimony. They contacted them in Europe. One of the witnesses was savvy enough to get a cell phone picture of one of the guys from the agency. I sent that along with an account of what happened to Pete Huckstra, who was then the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. And I said, look, they're trying to suborn testimony. It's a felony. The CIA is trying to suborn these people's sworn testimony, offer them passports and jobs and money and the rest of it, if only they would walk back their information about the 9/11 attacks. I called the CIA the CYA agency because that's what they were doing. They were just covering their backsides. And it's extraordinary the lengths that they went to for so many years.
Ken, you obviously have a great deal of depth in knowledge about Iran and experience. Tell us how you initially became involved. How did all this come to be?
Well, I was sitting in Paris as a young man, teaching English to young French women and writing novels, running a literary magazine when the revolution took place in 1979. And I got to know the first generation of exiles from the Shah's regime who all came to Paris. And then within a year and a half, I got to know all the next generation of exiles who were from the first Islamic government when they came to Paris because they'd been kicked out of power. And, one thing led to another. My wife and I had many Iranian friends. One of them, Ayatollah Mehdi Rouhani, a Shiite Ayatollah, joined my board of the Foundation for Democracy in Iran and taught me most of what I know about Islam in a number of sessions in his apartment in Paris, overlooking the bridge at Passy, that famous bridge from Last Tango in Paris. But he was the one who taught me that Islam considers if you are not a Muslim, you are in the house of war. The Muslims, not just Shia Muslims in Iran, but Sunnis as well, divide the world in the Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, and the Dar al-Harb, the house of war. If you are not a Muslim, you are in the house of war, and you must be opposed, defeated if possible, and ultimately converted to Islam. And it's one of those basic lessons that the people who were talking to George W. Bush, telling him that Islam was a religion of peace, it's one of those basic lessons that they never learned, or else they forgot and tried to dissimulate.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues in a moment with our guest, Ken Timmerman.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
SchillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
SchillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
SchillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
SchillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit SchillingShowMedia.com. That's SchillingShowMedia.com.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues. The Iran House is the new book by Ken Timmerman, and we're talking about very broadly Iran and the rest of the world. And now we have Donald Trump re-entering the White House very soon. Tell us about the present-day relationship of the U.S. and Iran and how that may change when there's a new sheriff in town.
Well, it's a adversarial relationship. Biden, like Obama before him, was trying to make a deal with the regime. He wanted to revive the Iran nuclear deal, which Obama had negotiated. By the way, Biden brought most of those same people who negotiated into the White House or into the State Department. And the chief negotiator, a guy named Rob Malley, was ultimately let go because there was apparent violations of his security clearance and leaks back to the Tehran regime. So the Democrats have had a cozy relationship with the regime. They've tended to overlook when, for example, regime proxies in Yemen launch cruise missiles against U.S. targets, against U.S. ships in the Red Sea. They tend to overlook that and not to pay too much attention. When Trump was president, first he walked out of the Iran deal, which was, I think, a wise thing to do. The Iranians were not living up to their part of the deal. And then he imposed what he called a maximum pressure campaign on the regime. And the intention of that was to get the regime to change its behavior. So he put pressure on them by limiting their oil exports, eventually got them down from about 2 million barrels a day down to 400,000 barrels a day. Now, that was important, and that was a great accomplishment because it basically just gave the Iranians less money to play with. They couldn't do as much damage with less money. But it didn't change their behavior. It did not change their intention. And I've been arguing at the America First Policy Institute, and I've made this argument publicly, and I'm sure the president-elect is well aware of it, that we should couple that maximum pressure with maximum support for the Iranian people. The Iranian people want to get rid of the regime. They need some help from the outside world. They need help with communications so they can not be tracked all the time by the regime goons, so they can protest and lead to more rolling protests around the country until ultimately they're able to get rid of the regime. But I argue that helping the Iranian people with this maximum support campaign is in the national security interest of the United States. And it's in our national security interest for a very simple reason. The mullahs in Tehran are a far greater danger to us immediately, and they've been killing our people. They've been killing our soldiers in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the Marine barracks in Beirut back in 1983. They've been killing our troops and our people repeatedly, and armed with nuclear weapons, just imagine what they will do. So it is in our interest to help the Iranian people to change the regime.
It seems, Ken, that there have been opportunities over the years, particularly during the Obama time, when there were popular uprisings in Iran, and instead the U.S. just seemed to turn a blind eye.
That's absolutely correct. The most notable example was 2009 in that, quote, stolen election. Ahmadinejad and 3 million people, the so-called Green Movement, took to the streets of Tehran and held up signs in English, "Obama, are you with us?" And Obama just kept silent for 3 weeks. So the Iranian regime on television made a play on words, and they said, no, Obama's not with you. Obamast, meaning Obama, he's with us. Us, meaning the regime. And that was very true. You had a second really massive uprising, even more important in my view, that started in late 2022. When the regime killed a Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, in jail for not wearing her headscarf. And the reason I think it was more important is because that uprising took place all across the country. It was not just based in Tehran. It was in Kurdish parts of Iran. It was in Baluchi parts of Iran. All of these Sunni territories on the periphery of the Persian heartland, as well as in Tehran. And I have always believed, and I've worked through my foundation, to help the Iranian opposition to bring together all of these disparate ethnic groups and political groups, and only when they are united can they ultimately succeed. I think they were also close in 2022 with that series of protests across the nation, but once again, you had a Democrat in the White House, Joe Biden, and the last thing he wanted to do was help the opponents of the mullahs. He was the best friend of the mullahs.
One of the things that's been so concerning to me, but to many people in America, are the pro-Palestinian protests that are rising up not only around the world, but in the United States, specifically at colleges and universities. Are these backed by Iran? And if so, how do we stop them?
I don't know if they're backed by Iran. I have seen information that some of the groups organizing these protests have received grants from George Soros and the Open Society Foundation. Iran, I don't know if they've done it. It's been more covert. But look, it's a disgrace to see anti-Semitism in its most rank and vile forms emerge on our college campuses, and the college authorities, the university authorities, do nothing about it. They tolerate the kind of anti-Semitic activity that has led to genocide in the past and that led to a Hamas attempt at a new genocide on October 7th. I just cannot understand how these college presidents who claim to be leading bastions of freedom and free thought and free thinking, how they could possibly tolerate the type of hate speech that we know leads to mass murder.
How do you think this will change that particular situation under Trump's second administration?
Well, I think the president-elect has spoken at various times, and others in Congress have as well, of defunding those colleges that don't ban anti-Semitic protests. I mean, these rank pro-Hamas anti-Semitic protests that you see. It's one thing to say, okay, we don't like Israel, we don't like the government of Israel, that's okay. But to say, from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free, what that means is genocide of the Jewish people in Israel. It's pretty simple and pretty straightforward. You cut off the funds. Many of these universities are getting tens of billions, scores of billions of dollars every year from the federal government. You cut that money off, and I think you would see a pretty quick change amongst the college presidents.
What about the people who are here in the country who are doing that, who are clearly anti-American, taking down American flags, raising Palestinian flags? Could they be part of the mass deportation, or is it too late for that?
Well, I think that's going to depend on their immigration status, because it's pretty established precedent that you can do unspeakable things to the American flag and not be prosecuted. It's covered under the First Amendment, and you can raise a Palestinian flag, you can raise an Iraqi flag, or whatever you want to do. You can raise the Red Star of China if you want, and that's covered as political speech. If you are in the country illegally, that could become something else. My understanding is President Trump and Tom Homan, his new border czar, have been talking about a mass deportation of criminal aliens, people who have actually committed felonies in this country. I'm not sure that a free speech violation is a felony at this point.
We were talking about the Iranian people and the possibility of another uprising and supporting that. What would be the aftermath of that? Would there be a secular government imposed in Iran, or what might follow?
Well, this is going to be up to the Iranian people. But from what I know and the people that I talk to, it is hard to imagine anything but a secular government, because they're fed up with the Islamic regime. And when I say fed up, I'm talking about 75 to 80% of the people in the country are fed up with the Islamic regime. By the way, the attendance in mosques is way, way down. It's something like 10 or 20% of what it was under the Shah. People don't go to the mosque any longer. They are outwardly anti-religious. They attack mullahs on the streets. They knock their turbans off. And we don't hear about that very much in the West. But there's a very, very strong anti-Islamic current in Iran today. And I would expect that a successor regime would certainly not be an Islamic republic. It would be a republic.
I'd like to talk about the relationship between Iran and Israel, and particularly Netanyahu, who seems to be very firmly committed to defeating Iran, which is an existential threat to Israel.
Well, and Netanyahu makes very clear that he is determined to defeat the Islamic Republic of Iran, not the Iranian people.
Yes.
And many, many, many Iranians I know like to talk about the relationship between Iran, the Persian people, and the Jews. Cyrus the Great, remember, liberated the Jews after he defeated the successors of Nebuchadnezzar, who had taken them hostage out of Israel. I think there's a long-standing friendship between the Jewish people and the Iranian people writ large, not just the Persians, but the Iranian people writ large. And once this Islamic regime, this Islamic dictatorship is gone, I think you'll see a flourishing of ties between Israel and Iran.
Israel has been under attack by Iranian proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. And yet, miraculously, and this is certainly God's hand, very few Israeli lives have been lost in the recent barrages. What is to follow? Certainly Israel's been constrained by the Biden administration, but what do you think Israel will do next?
Well, that's a good question. I think they're trying to declare victory against Hezbollah, but Hezbollah still seems to have enough missiles to launch into northern Israel, and part of victory is a security situation. So the people who have evacuated from those settlements in the north, and I write about this in the book, what it looks like. I actually followed that border during the 2006 war. They've all had to leave. It's barren. They haven't been they haven't been able to harvest their crops. They haven't been able to send their kids to school, and there's 80 to 100,000 people who need to go home, and they can't when they're under the threat of Hezbollah missile attacks. So the Israelis have got to do something to stop those attacks and stop them, as completely as possible. They have joked recently, the former defense minister, noting a new Secretary General of Hezbollah. He said that, this is just a temporary appointment because every time there's a new Secretary General of Hezbollah, the Israelis managed to whack him within a week. I think that is starting to get through to many Hezbollah leaders. They're laying low. They don't want to stand up to be counted so Israel can attack them. But they need to secure the north. They also need to secure, obviously, Gaza. They need to make sure that Hamas cannot rise up again. These are tough jobs. They need to win a victory the way the Allies won a victory in 1945 against Nazi Germany.
What signs of hope, Ken, finally do we have for the region? Certainly the restarting of the Abraham Accords might be helpful there, but what do you foresee in the next few years?
President Trump has made very clear that he wants to see a peaceful Middle East. And a peaceful Middle East means that Israel has won its war against Hamas and Hezbollah, and that in one way or another, the Iranian regime is no longer the threat it is today. How forward-leaning does the president want to be when it comes to helping the people of Iran? We'll see. We'll have to see. I think he's going to find that the only way that we can have a secure and peaceful Middle East will be without the Islamic Republic of Iran. As long as that regime exists, as long as they are armed, as long as they're selling oil, they will be a threat to the United States, to their neighbors, and to the state of Israel.
Ken Timmerman, if people would like to get a copy of your new book, The Iran House, or if they'd like to follow your efforts online, would you tell us how?
Sure. Just go to my website, kentimmerman.com, and you'll find links to the book and earlier books that I've written. You can also sign up to get my weekly email newsletter. It's kind of a column that I do once a week for my subscribers. So it's kentimmerman.com.
It's great and important information, and I certainly hope that the incoming administration will take advantage of your knowledge in forming their foreign policy. Ken Timmerman, thank you for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.